it's so hard to get a word in edgewise. But you can see why I love this guy, right? So something that might be crossing your mind, hopefully it's not, but maybe, like, okay, that's great, Shea. You
Showering with Barry Bonds?
You played at this high level. You did something that that doesn't relate to business. You might be thinking that so much of this absolutely relates to business, right? Because who you end up putting yourself around, and the way you think about things. He talks about, he mentions, a fraud, a failure. Has anybody ever felt like that like they're a fraud, they're a failure, that they don't measure up or anything like that? So if you don't know how I ended up here, how Catherine and I ended up here, I want to tell you real quickly, because this is a great story. So, when Shea talks about, trying to kill himself in front of a van, in front of his ex-wife's house, I've talked to him about this. I'm like, dude, that was one of the best days of your life. Absolutely one of the best days of your life, because that was a transition point for him. And I think he knows that. Hopefully he knows that. So one day I have this cybersecurity firm, and man, we're just going 100 miles an hour, growth. And when I've got this accountant. It's like, we need to talk because we've got some problems. Now we don't have any problems. And he'd say, we've got 3 problems. We have a group inside the company it's not working. We've got 8 people that were waiting for a contract to come in, and the contract hasn't come in for 8 weeks. I mean, do the math, right? That's 2 months. That's 8 people. That's 16 months of basically salaries and free. And goes, and we just took out a bad loan. All these things came together. And I just kept telling him, you don't understand. All we got to do is sell more. We need more revenue. We need to drive more. We can outrun this thing. And he finally gets it over to me through my head that we're $750,000 in debt, the company is. Which, if you're a big, colossal company, that's nothing. If you're a small company, 15, 20 people like we were, it was catastrophic. So I go from, I'm this excited person, we're going to kill it, we're killing it, we're doing this, we're going to outrun it, to going home and going, what was I doing? I mean, I had that awareness now of like just how bad things were. And I spent 2 weeks sitting in a chair very much like these, looking at a TV set. And I don't watch much TV. Looking at a TV set, not even aware of what's going on, just going all of those things that go through your head when you start to self-sabotage, and you're like, I'm this, I'm that, I'm horrible, and people are like, why don't you file bankruptcy and quit and go get a job or go do something else? And I'm like, I owe $250,000 to the IRS. The IRS does not forgive. The only way I can pay this thing off is this freaking crappy company I hate. So I got to stick it out so I can pay off the IRS. But I'm a failure. I'm a fraud. I'm beating myself up. I'm like, oh my gosh, Wesley Snipes went to jail for tax evasion. I'm going to go to jail for tax evasion. Go talk to our tax attorney. He goes, it's not the same thing. But unfortunately, I realized I was going to go to jail for tax evasion on a Friday night, which meant I had Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, until I talked to the guy on Monday to find out that I'm not going to go to jail for that, right? But I'm this huge fraud and this failure. And I knew exactly a point in time in my life when I was a fraud and a failure. And I start paying off the debt of the company, right? Not because people are like, oh, it's so great that you stuck it out. Man, you mean you didn't file bankruptcy? That's so awesome. And I'm like really quickly to tell people, I'm like, man, if I didn't owe $250,000 to the IRS, I would have been, see ya. I would have been gone. But that was the hook to keep me there. And I hated my company and I hated myself. And I would like go down the road on the way to the office because I couldn't let my employees, the few that were still there, know how bad things were. So I would like just be beat up, and I would drive down the road screaming, yeah, man, yeah, who wants this? Who feels like a man? You're a man, you're the man, you're the man. Going over this to myself repeatedly. Woo, yeah. I'd walk in the door and be like, hey, how's everybody doing, man? Let's kill this thing. I'd walk into my office and be like, oh my gosh, that was so draining. And I would just like then I'd pump myself up to get these guys excited as if they didn't see the reality. I thought I could fake that. And I spent so much time believing I was a fraud. And so I started writing that book as therapy to myself. I wrote a chapter. It was about thoughts, because all of a sudden, I mean, I'm in this horrible spot, and then I get this like clearing, and I'm like, oh wow, things were going to be okay. So I write this paper to myself. I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's chapter 1. And then I get this another time, and I'm like, oh, that's chapter 2. And I go like, oh, I think I'm writing a book. That's how that book came about. But once I started to realize slowly but surely that I was becoming whole, and maybe I could actually do something, right? But that day in my head was the worst day of my life. And so between then and February of last year, when I have another company called Refiners, which will at some point in time absorb into this organization. It's like an advisory board, peer-to-peer networking group. But it wasn't until we had that conference, and I'm sitting there having a discussion much like this, except it was online, with a guy named Naveen Jain, who's a multi-billionaire, owns a company called Viome that measures the microbiome of your gut, Moon Express. Wrote a phenomenal book called Moonshot, which if you haven't ever read, you ought to read it. It's a great book. And he's having this discussion with me, right? And over the years, you know, I mean, I was driving Uber. I wasn't taking a paycheck out of my company. I mean, I hated myself. I mean, people would be like, so what else do you do besides drive Uber? Oh, I'm a CEO of a cybersecurity, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, wait, what? And I'd be like, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to lie and just go, this is all I do. And it was hard. It was horrible. But I'm sitting there across from Naveen Jain. And over that period of years, I wrote a book. I started a company that I'm helping other business owners with Refiners. I become the best business person I had ever been in my entire life. And all I could think about in my head was that day was the worst day of my life. I'm sitting here having this discussion with Naveen Jain. You know, Shea was a speaker at that conference. We had 15, I jokingly say, 15 great speakers, and me, one sucked, right?
You say that about me.
I say that when we're not together. I tell other people it was you that sucked. But I'm talking to Naveen Jain, and I mentioned, I wasn't talking about me, I was talking about somebody else, and I mentioned this person talked about this day in their life being the worst day of their life. And he shuts me down in front of everybody. We had like 900 people online in person. And he goes, no, don't ever say that. Don't ever judge a day in your life as being the worst day of your life or anything, because you don't know what the future is going to bring. That might not have been the worst day of their life. They just don't know it. And I'm like sitting there listening to him. I'm like, oh man, like I'm having this awareness. Matter of fact, I'm loading up all of the Refiner Conference talks on the Networking Phoenix YouTube channel. And that one is up there now, but with myself and Naveen Jain. And I'll let people know about those later once they're all uploaded. But he's talking, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I labeled that the worst day of my life. And all of a sudden I realized, short of, getting married, having children, and those things that happen, I'm like, what I was labeling as the worst day of my life was the best day of my life, because it ultimately led to things like this, with me being here and doing things that I really love and helping people and that. So it's just this really weird thing. Like, what's the relationship that we have with ourselves? Because, it's great. I'm having, I consider this guy one of my best friends. How cool is that? And it's okay. I'm having discussions with Steve Sims, with, Tim Grover, Coach Burr, all these people. But in my mind, I was thinking, how horrible my life was. But that situation opened it up to have really great relationships. And so you think about those relationships first. What is it that you have with yourself, and then what is it that you have with others, and like who's around you, right? So Catherine and I went to a restaurant, and we're sitting there. I'm looking around, and I'm like, man, there's a lot of fat, and I've lost over 100 pounds, so I know what that's like. But they're it was just, not just old, but old soul. Like they were just tired, right? It was just, this restaurant was just like I mean, the people, and I just went. Thankfully, the food here is bad, because if it was great, I'd like want to be here because the food was great. But I was like, I don't want to be here again, because if we come here enough, this is who we become. This is the people that we associate with. So that's why it's so important that we like not only who are we and how do we accept ourselves, but who do we align ourselves with?